Okay, let's jump right into this deep dive. Today we're looking at some really interesting source material. It's pulled from a live stand-up comedy performance.
That's right. And our mission basically is to, unpack the observations and the perspectives this comedian shares. We're looking at how he uses humor, personal stories,
Right.
to kind of talk about big topics like identity, race, generational friction, societal changes, just living today, really.
It's a pretty unique lens, isn't it? Taking everything from like quick interactions with the audience to deeper thoughts on how social norms, language,
Right.
it's all shifting.
Yeah, think of it as one person's take on cultural shifts, using very specific, sometimes very funny examples from his own life and what he sees.
It gives us a really grounded sort of anecdotal look at these huge ideas. All right,
Yeah.
so let's start where the comedian does. He's immediately engaging with the audience. And it's kind of striking, right? How fast he just starts identifying people by nationality.
Yeah, UK, Russia, Dubai, Mexico, South Africa, Philippines, China, Pakistan.
Yeah.
He just calls them out.
Right off the bat. So identity based on where you're from, that's front and center.
Instantly sets the stage,
Yeah.
especially in a place like Dubai, which is, such a global hub.
Yeah.
And he makes that provocative point, doesn't he? If you don't have an Emirati passport, you're just visiting.
Huh. Yeah. It's funny, but it's also kind of pointed. Like, even in this big melting pot, there's still this idea of who really belongs. Citizenship as the marker.
And then he immediately follows up with those quick-fire stereotypical observations about the different groups.
Yeah, the Russians having lots of kids, the Mexican jokes about hopping walls and Home Depot.
Cools?
Pools, right. And he even touches on Indians somehow owning another Indian person in Dubai, which feels like maybe a commentary on labor dynamics there.
Yeah, it could be. These are obviously broad generalizations,
Yeah.
for laughs, but they do tap into common stereotypes people encounter.
For sure. And that bit about the Filipino wife and the Indian husband, playing on that driver nanny stereotype.
It really shows how perceptions can just assign roles based on, assumptions about where you're from or your status.
He also spends a bit of time unpacking the term white people, arguing it's not just about skin color.
Right. He says appearance can be really misleading. He uses the example of, like, light-skinned people from northern India or Pakistan.
Physically, they might look lighter than some people we'd call white, but they aren't grouped that way, culturally or socially, in the way he means it.
And that's his key point, I think, that white people isn't just a color descriptor, it's a specific sociocultural group. And just having fair skin doesn't automatically put you in it.
He mentions, historical labels landing elsewhere, even if skin tone is similar.
Exactly. And he has that very blunt, kind of crude way he jokes about telling the difference.
Oh, right, identifying them by name, like Gerprit or that chocolate nipples line.
Yeah, it's definitely provocative, meant to get a reaction. But it underscores his point that there are other markers, maybe subtle physical things or cultural identifiers like names, that differentiate groups beyond just skin tone. At least that's his comedic angle.
So this whole first part, it really frames identity as something perceived through quick judgments, origin, location, appearance, often using stereotypes for humor. And building on that idea of identity and how people see things, he then kind of shifts gears to talk about his own family, the whole dynamic of mixed identities.
Yeah, he lays out his personal setup, which is pretty diverse, and he does it humorously. He's got 4 kids, but jokes he only made 2.
Right. 2 were with his current wife, who already had 2 daughters, and his own 2 kids are from 2 different women.
And he throws in that line, "Thanks, Jamaicans," kind of attributing some life choices, maybe even this family structure, to that influence.
And the kids themselves, they're all mixed. His own 2 are half Hispanic Ecuadorian from one mom, half Mexican from another. He kind of lumps them together as Hispanic-Mexican.
And his stepdaughters are half black and half Filipina.
Yeah.
So it's a really diverse household.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting here, I think, is his observation about mixed kids, how they seem to lean more towards one side of their heritage as they grow up.
He gives examples, right? His 13-year-old daughter, Ecuadorian mom, Indian dad, she's leaning Indian, he says.
Yeah. And his son, who's 4.5, Mexican mom, Indian dad, is leaning a lot more Mexican than he expected.
Bringing back those Home Depot and pool fence jokes again for the son, like that's the cultural signifier for him.
It's an interesting anecdotal observation, suggesting identity for mixed kids isn't always this perfect 50-50 blend. It can be, dynamic. They might connect more strongly with one part of their background.
Influenced by who knows what exactly. He just presents it playfully.
And his joke about the whole house being this mix, Indian, Filipina, Hispanic, black, and the only pure breeds are the dogs.
Right.
It's a funny way to highlight just how complex, maybe even outdated, those old racial labels feel in a modern multi-ethnic family.
So yeah, this section really gets into the personal side, raising a diverse family, and how identity kind of plays out differently for the next generation. It's a shift from the broader audience stuff. That feeling of observing the next generation, it leads us right into what feels like a really central theme for him, the generational clash. Specifically, his generation, Gen X versus Gen Z.
Oh yeah, this is a big chunk. And he leans right into that classic pattern, Getting older means you just inevitably get annoyed by the younger generation.
He calls it an inevitable, that feeling that young people just bother you or talk too much, the whole just shut the F up vibe.
Right. And he totally admits his own generation is unreasonably annoyed by Gen Z. He owns that.
So what are the complaints he lists? Gen Z's lazy, don't want to work hard.
Jobs like influencers, opening packages online, unboxing stuff. He sees those as not real jobs.
They're always on their phones, never knew life without the internet. They're soft because, well, their parents didn't hit them.
He also adds, they're perceived as fake, like they don't know how to be real, and specifically, they don't get ball breaking.
Right, that kind of teasing, ribbing culture from back then.
Exactly. And just generally too sensitive, easily offended, all the standard complaints, really.
But then, and this is the great part, I think he flips it. He argues that his generation, Gen X, is actually the reason for all these traits they complain about.
Yes. That's the core insight here, delivered with humor. He's like, we worked hard so our kids wouldn't have to. So, of course, they seem lazy by comparison.
We made the cell phone and the internet, so why complain? They're always on them.
Exactly. And they're the parents who decided not to whoop their asses. So, that's where the soft generation comes from.
It's a really sharp, funny take. The things you criticize are basically the direct result of your own actions and choices.
Precisely. It's a comedic look at that cycle of generational complaints. Each generation creates the conditions for the next and then gripes about the outcome.
So the takeaway is, it's not just different behaviors, it's cause and effect, maybe unintended, from the previous generation's efforts. And this whole discussion about generations, it flows pretty naturally into the next topic. Political correctness, sensitivity, how language keeps changing.
Yeah, and he argues that PC, political correctness, actually started with his generation, with Gen X. But he says it was out of necessity, not boredom.
Right, not just looking for things to be mad about.
Yeah.
He frames it as a reaction to their parents' generation, people born in like the 1920s.
Who used terms that were casually racist or just outdated without really thinking about it. He gives those examples from his mom, like calling a Chinese family the Oriental family, or talking about a young Negro boy.
Just language that was common then, but sounds really jarring now. And he says their goal, Gen X's goal, was to make little differences.
To create less speed bumps for the future. Basically, smoothing out some of that casual prejudice in everyday talk.
But from his perspective, Gen Z has taken this whole thing to another level, or maybe went extreme with it.
That's his take. He points specifically to how quickly the acceptable language evolves, especially around things like disability and sexuality.
He talks about the word retard. He notes that, for him, he still uses it in certain contexts, like referencing the French word for delayed or seeing it on medicine labels overseas.
Yeah, he makes that joke about, do I have to stop saying it if the French haven't? It's his way of showing how context and culture make language rules feel complicated or, to him, inconsistent.
And he talks about the word gay. He gets that calling gay people gay is just a fact, but his point is about using gay as just a general insult for something bad.
Right. He argues that back in the 70s or 80s, calling something gay among friends wasn't necessarily meant with malice towards gay people. It was just a common, though, clearly problematic now, term for uncool or lame.
He suggests they maybe didn't fully grasp that gay was a real thing in the same way people understand identity now.
And he uses that example of calling his straight friend with 4 kids gay, just to show how absurdly it was used back then, almost detached from its actual meaning.
Right, just as a generic put-down.
And then he brings in the newer stuff around gender identity, using that exaggerated identifying as a table example.
Which is obviously hyperbole.
Of course. But it conveys that feeling from his generation's perspective of things changing so fast, labels expanding in ways they find maybe confusing or hard to keep up with.
So the source really presents this idea. PC started with good intentions in Gen X, trying to fix language, but its evolution in Gen Z has created new tensions. clashes over how fast language changes and what's actually offensive. Okay, and finally, he shifts focus one more time, this time, to the idea of anxiety and how he contrasts modern claims of anxiety with, well, struggles from the past.
Yeah, he kind of puts forward this view that maybe some younger people claiming anxiety don't understand what he sees as real anxiety because they haven't faced certain kinds of adult problems.
What does he list? Tax problems, having multiple baby mamas.
Yeah,
Things he sees as genuine high-stress life challenges from his time.
exactly. And to really hammer home this idea of real anxiety from his generation, Gen X, he uses this incredibly detailed, long anecdote about trying to watch porn in the 80s.
Right. It's such a specific, funny example. He sets it up by contrasting it with how easy it is today. Pornhub, phones, VPNs, it's instant.
But back then,
Yeah.
in the 80s, he describes it as this super elaborate, high-stakes mission. You had the one TV, the one VCR, usually in the living room.
Had to wait till everyone's asleep, like 2 a.m., sneaking around your own house. What did he call it? A perverted burglar with an erection.
Yeah. And turning on the TV, but hitting the volume button at the exact same time.
Yeah.
Having jungle ears like his dad, always listening.
Loading the VCR tape, but putting a pillow over it to muffle the clunking noise.
Oh, yeah. And then dealing with the screen, the test pattern, the scary FBI warning, and crucially, fiddling with the tracking button to get a clear picture.
That's where those jokes came in, right? The shaking boob, wondering if it's a nipple or a hubcap.
Or Parkinson's porn because the image was so unstable.
It's such a vivid description, step by step. You feel the effort, the planning, the risk, the sheer technical frustration compared to just clicking a link today.
He uses this whole elaborate process as like the perfect humorous example of everyday obstacles and the literal anxiety involved in just trying to do something specific back then.
He also throws in a little critique of modern porn, doesn't he? Pornhub taking away the mystery.
Yeah, no build-up, just scenes. And the explicit titles, he compares them to boring white people's food titles versus like more evocative Indian food names. It's a funny aside.
And he briefly mentioned the Sears catalog too, right? The underwear section as another early source of suggestive imagery.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the natural bushy look back then.
Yeah.
And tracing how female body hair trends changed. Bushy 80s, landing strip 90s, bald 2000s, and then his joke about 2023.
Right, the dick comment. Very blunt.
Yeah.
So yeah, that whole detailed 80s porn story, it really serves as this specific, funny illustration of his point about past versus present struggles. It shows how technology just completely changes our experiences. And maybe changes our perception of what counts as difficult or what anxiety feels like. It's all seen through his comedic lens, of course. So wrapping this up, we've kind of journeyed through this comedian's worldview, right? Starting with identity based on where you're from, how you look.
Yeah, then moving into the personal stuff, raising a mixed-race family, those nuances.
Then the big one, the generational clash, Gen X versus Z, but with that twist that maybe Gen X created the issues they complain about.
Mm-hmm. Followed by the evolution of language, political correctness, where it started versus where it seems to be going now, according to him.
And finally, that really detailed contrast between past and present struggles, using that whole 80s porn quest as his prime example of real anxiety.
And it's important to remember, right, this is all delivered in a stand-up comedy context. It's drawn from his life, his perspective, designed to make people laugh.
But it definitely offers some interesting, sometimes maybe uncomfortable insights into navigating today's world, all the friction points around identity, language, generations.
Exactly. And for you listening, the real value might be just reflecting on these viewpoints. How do your own experiences line up or not? How do you see identity playing out?
Or those generational differences, where do you see them? In your family, at work, and how does the sheer speed of change, technology, social norms,
Yeah.
how does that affect how we all communicate and maybe understand each other or misunderstand each other?
It definitely leaves you with something to think about. Here's a final thought maybe. Given how fast everything keeps evolving, language, tech, social rules, what things that seem totally normal or acceptable to us today, what might future generations look back on and just find completely baffling? Or outdated? Or maybe even offensive?
That's a good question to chew on, something to mull over. Okay, that's our deep dive for today.